July 22nd, 2003. Mosul, Iraq. A quiet villa in a middle-class neighborhood. Neighbors going about their morning routines. Children playing in nearby streets. Just another day in a war-torn city trying to find normalcy. Then, at 10 a.m., the silence shattered. For the next 6 hours, one of the most intense urban firefights of the Iraq War would rage through that neighborhood. Apache helicopters would circle overhead. Hellfire missiles would tear through concrete walls. And by sunset, the villa would be nothing but smoking rubble. Inside, the bodies of Saddam Hussein's 2 sons would lie among the ruins. This is the story of the raid that ended the bloodline of Iraq's most feared family. The invasion and the vanishing. March 20th, 2003. Operation Iraqi Freedom begins. U.S. and coalition forces launch a massive invasion of Iraq with a clear objective: remove Saddam Hussein from power and dismantle the Ba'athist regime that had ruled Iraq with an iron fist for over 2 decades. Within weeks, American tanks roll through Baghdad. Saddam's government collapses. Statues of the dictator are toppled in city squares. Iraqis flood the streets, some celebrating, others looting government buildings in chaos. But amid the fall of the capital, 3 men disappear without a trace. Saddam Hussein himself vanishes into the countryside, and with him, his 2 sons, Uday and Qusay Hussein. For the next 4 months, they become ghosts. The most wanted men in Iraq, hunted by the most powerful military on earth, simply vanish into the landscape. The sons of a dictator. To understand why the hunt for these men was so critical, you need to understand who they were. Uday Hussein, born June 18, 1964, was Saddam's eldest son. As the firstborn, he was initially groomed to be his father's successor. He controlled the Iraqi Olympic Committee, ran media operations, and lived a life of extreme wealth and privilege. But Uday was volatile, violent, and unpredictable. In 1988, at a party attended by foreign dignitaries and Iraqi officials, he beat his father's personal valet to death with a club in front of dozens of witnesses. The victim, Kamal Hana Gegeo, had served Saddam loyally for years. Even Saddam was disturbed by this public display of brutality. He briefly exiled Uday to Switzerland, but within months, his son was back in Iraq, his power intact. Throughout the 1990s, Uday became known for extreme cruelty. He was accused of torturing athletes who disappointed him in competition, of seizing property from wealthy Iraqis at gunpoint, and of systematic abuse against Iraqi civilians, particularly women. His reputation for violence made him feared even within the regime itself. By 2003, even Saddam had largely sidelined Uday from real power. Qusay Hussein was different. Born in 1966, he was quieter, more calculated, and far more dangerous in terms of actual authority. While Uday sought the spotlight, Qusay controlled the shadows. He ran Iraq's intelligence services, commanded the elite Republican Guard, and oversaw the Special Security Organization, the force responsible for protecting the regime and crushing dissent. During the 1991 uprisings that followed the Gulf War, when Shia and Kurdish populations rose up against Saddam's rule, Qusay led the brutal crackdown. Thousands of Iraqi civilians were killed in those operations, and entire communities were terrorized back into submission. By the time of the 2003 invasion, Qusay was widely considered Saddam's likely successor. He was the operational brain behind much of the regime's security apparatus. Together, these 2 men represented the future of Saddam's Iraq, a future built on fear, violence, and absolute control. And now, they were running for their lives. The Most Wanted Deck, April 2003. With Baghdad fallen and the Hussein family scattered, the U.S. military faced a challenge. How do you help thousands of troops recognize Iraq's most wanted fugitives? The answer was surprisingly simple: a deck of playing cards. The Pentagon created what became known as the Iraqi Most Wanted Deck. Each of the 52 cards featured a photograph and information about a high-ranking member of Saddam's regime. The higher the card's rank, the more important the target. Saddam himself was the ace of spades, the most valuable card in the deck. Uday Hussein was the ace of hearts. Qusay Hussein was the ace of clubs. The cards were distributed to every soldier in Iraq. They were printed on leaflets and dropped over Iraqi cities. Posters went up on walls across the country. And most importantly, massive bounties were placed on their heads. $30 million. $15 million for Uday. $15 million for Qusay. To put that in perspective, it was one of the largest cash rewards ever offered for fugitives in modern history. For comparison, the reward for Osama bin Laden at the time was $25 million. For ordinary Iraqis struggling in a war-torn economy, $30 million was an unimaginable fortune. It was generational wealth. It was a ticket to a completely different life. The message was clear: anyone who helped capture or kill Saddam's sons would become rich beyond their wildest dreams. The hunt. For months, nothing. U.S. forces raided homes across Iraq. They swept through Tikrit, Saddam's hometown and stronghold. They searched Baghdad neighborhoods where regime loyalists might hide. They questioned tribal leaders, former Ba'ath Party members, and anyone with possible connections. Helicopters circled suspicious compounds. Intelligence officers analyzed intercepted communications. Informants were debriefed. Patterns were studied. But Uday and Qusay remained invisible. Some believed they had fled to Syria, crossing the porous border under cover of darkness. Others thought they were being sheltered by tribal networks in the western desert, moving from safe house to safe house every few days. There were false leads, bad intelligence, dead ends. The pressure mounted. Every day the brothers remained free was a propaganda victory for regime loyalists and a blow to American credibility. Then, in mid-July 2003, a break. The betrayal. The brothers had fled north to Mosul, Iraq's second-largest city, located near the Syrian border. It was a strategic choice. Mosul had been a Ba'athist stronghold for decades. Many residents had benefited from Saddam's regime through government jobs, military positions, and business contracts. Anti-American sentiment ran high. Loyalty to the old regime remained strong. It was the kind of place where neighbors kept secrets and strangers were noticed immediately, the perfect hiding spot. At first, Uday and Qusay moved between different safe houses, never staying in one location too long. Only a small circle of trusted contacts knew their whereabouts, people with deep ties to the regime or personal connections to the Hussein family. Eventually, they settled in a villa owned by Nawaf al-Zaidan, a businessman with long-standing connections to Saddam's inner circle. The house was located in the Al-Fala neighborhood, a middle-class area that wouldn't draw suspicion. The villa was large, 3 stories, with thick outer walls and heavy metal doors. From the outside, it looked like any other prosperous home in the neighborhood. But inside, it was now shelter for Iraq's most wanted fugitives. Qusay had also brought his 14-year-old son, Mustafa. The boy stayed close to his father, quiet and obedient. Whether Qusay brought him for protection or simply couldn't leave him behind, no one knows. But the presence of a child added another layer of complexity and risk. By mid-July, something changed. Maybe Nawaf al-Zaydan feared being caught. Maybe the constant pressure was too much. Maybe loyalty to the regime was fading as the reality of its collapse set in. Or maybe $30 million was simply too much money to ignore. On July 21, 2003, Nawaf made contact with American forces through an intermediary. He told them exactly where Uday and Qusay Hussein were hiding. The confirmation. The Americans had received dozens of tips before. Most led nowhere. Some were deliberate misinformation. Others were honest mistakes. People who thought they'd seen the brothers but were wrong. But this tip felt different. The source had credible connections to the regime. The details were specific. The exact address, a description of the house, confirmation that both brothers were inside. A small reconnaissance team was sent to Mosul immediately. They observed the neighborhood from a distance, watched the house, gathered intelligence. By the end of the day, they were confident. The brothers were inside. U.S. command didn't hesitate. They began preparing for a full-scale military operation. This wouldn't be a quiet arrest. The assumption was that Uday and Qusay were heavily armed, trained in combat, and willing to die rather than surrender. The plan was straightforward. Surround the house, demand surrender, and if refused, bring overwhelming force until the threat was neutralized. Task Force 20, an elite special operations unit created specifically to hunt down high-value targets from Saddam's regime, was assigned to lead the mission. They would be supported by soldiers from the 101st Airborne Division. On the morning of July 22, 2003, the operation began. The battle begins. At approximately 10 a.m., American forces moved into position around the villa. Delta Force commandos from Task Force 20 took strategic positions. Soldiers from the 101st Airborne secured the perimeter. Armored Humvees and Bradley fighting vehicles blocked the streets. Overhead, helicopters circled. Snipers positioned themselves on nearby rooftops. Civilians were quickly evacuated from the immediate area to minimize risk. Using loudspeakers, American soldiers called out in Arabic, ordering everyone inside to come out with their hands up. They promised safe treatment if they surrendered peacefully. Silence. Then, gunfire erupted from the upper floors of the villa. Bullets tore through windows and walls. The Americans immediately returned fire, taking cover behind vehicles and walls. It was clear. There would be no surrender. 6 hours of hell. Inside the villa, the brothers had prepared a strong defensive position. They were on the second and third floors, using the elevation to their advantage. They had assault rifles, grenades, and substantial ammunition. Reports later indicated that even Qusay's 14-year-old son, Mustafa, was armed and firing. The Americans tried multiple approaches. Small assault teams attempted to breach the building, but were met with withering fire each time they approached. Machine guns, grenade launchers, and AT-4 rockets were brought to bear. Smoke filled the air. Glass and concrete exploded outward. The sound was deafening. But the brothers held their position. After nearly an hour of intense fighting with no resolution, commanders made a decision. They needed heavier firepower. Apache attack helicopters from the 101st Airborne were called in. One Apache locked onto the second floor and fired a Hellfire missile. The explosion was massive. Part of the second story collapsed in flames and debris. But incredibly, The shooting continued. The defenders were moving through the building, shifting positions, using furniture as cover, refusing to stop fighting. A second Hellfire missile was fired, this time targeting the roof. Another devastating impact. More of the building collapsed. And still, gunfire came from inside. The cost. The battle raged for over 6 hours, making it one of the longest sustained firefights U.S. forces had faced since the invasion began. Several American soldiers were wounded during the operation. Some were hit by gunfire from the upper floors. Others were injured by shrapnel from grenades and exploding debris. Medics treated the wounded on site, working under fire, pulling casualties to safety behind armored vehicles. Despite the injuries, the operation continued. More reinforcements arrived. The cordon tightened. By around 4 p.m., the gunfire finally stopped. No more shots came from inside the ruined villa. The silence. At 5 p.m., with the threat neutralized, American troops moved in. The scene was total destruction. The villa was barely standing. Walls were blown apart. The roof had partially collapsed. Smoke still rose from burning debris. Soldiers moved carefully through the wreckage, checking for traps, searching for survivors. They found 4 bodies in the ruins of the upper floors. 2 adult males, 1 teenage boy, 1 bodyguard. All had been killed in the firefight. One of the adult males had a gunshot wound to the head, likely from the final moments of combat. The teenager had been shot multiple times. Photographs were taken immediately and sent to military intelligence. This was too important to leave to chance. They needed absolute confirmation. The identification. Military intelligence teams worked quickly. They used dental records, medical files, X-rays, and physical evidence to confirm the identities. Uday had distinctive injuries from a 1996 assassination attempt, including metal rods in his leg and specific surgical scars. Qusay had his own medical history on file. Forensic specialists compared facial features, bone structure, and documented injuries. After careful analysis, the results came in. The 2 adult males were confirmed to be Uday Hussein and Qusay Hussein. The teenage boy was Qusay's son, Mustafa. The 4th man was their bodyguard. The announcement, July 24, 2003. 2 days after the firefight, U.S. military spokesman held a press conference and announced the deaths to the world. To prove it beyond doubt, and to silence conspiracy theories that were already spreading through Iraq, they made a controversial decision. They released photographs of the bodies. The images were graphic. They showed the deceased in clinical detail. The decision was heavily debated within the U.S. command structure. Some officials argued it was necessary to provide definitive proof and to send a message to remaining regime loyalists that the Hussein family's power was truly broken. Others felt the images were too graphic and violated dignity, even for enemies. But in Iraq, the effect was immediate and profound. The reaction. Across Iraq, the response was mixed and emotional. In Baghdad and southern Iraq, where Saddam's regime had brutally suppressed Shia populations for decades, people flooded into the streets. Some fired rifles into the air in celebration. Others wept openly, not from sadness, but from overwhelming relief. For them, the deaths of Uday and Qusay felt like the true beginning of the end. Saddam himself was still at large, but his sons, the heirs to his terror, were gone. In northern Iraq and areas with strong tribal or Ba'athist loyalty, the reaction was different. Shock, anger, disbelief. Rumors spread immediately that the bodies were fake, that the men in the photos were body doubles, that the Americans had staged everything. But as more forensic evidence was released and independent sources confirmed the deaths, even the skeptics began to accept the reality. The sons of Saddam Hussein were dead. The aftermath. Once identification was complete, U.S. forces transported the bodies to Baghdad, then secretly to Tikrit, where the Hussein family cemetery was located. There was no public funeral, no ceremony. The burials were conducted under tight security, with only a handful of people present. The graves were left unmarked, and their exact locations kept secret to prevent them from becoming shrines or rallying points for insurgents. Meanwhile, Nawaf al-Zaidan quietly received the full $30 million reward, making him one of the highest-paid informants in modern history. For his safety, U.S. intelligence arranged for him and his family to leave Iraq permanently. His identity was never officially confirmed by the military, but it leaked through Iraqi sources in the following months. Where Nawaf went after that remains unknown. Some reports suggest he relocated to Europe or the Gulf region with a new identity. Others claim he disappeared completely. The villa where the battle took place was left as rubble. Neighbors later said the firefight shook their homes and that some were injured by flying debris, though no civilians were killed. The U.S. military stated they had worked to minimize civilian casualties, but once the shooting started, they had no choice but to respond with overwhelming force. The war continues. The deaths of Uday and Qusay were a major victory for U.S. forces. They demonstrated that even the most protected members of Saddam's inner circle could be found and eliminated. For many Iraqis, it provided a sense of justice and hope that the era of the Hussein family's brutality was truly ending. But the war was far from over. Just 5 months later, in December 2003, U.S. troops captured Saddam Hussein himself, found hiding in a small underground hole near Tikrit. That marked another symbolic victory. Yet even after the fall of Saddam and his sons, Iraq descended into years of insurgency, sectarian violence, and instability. American troops would remain in Iraq for nearly another decade, facing attacks from various insurgent groups and militias. The battle in Mosul ended the Hussein dynasty, but it did not end the war. Reflections on July 22, 2003. The 6-hour firefight in Mosul remains one of the most significant military operations of the Iraq War. It demonstrated the lengths to which regime loyalists would go to avoid capture, fighting to the death rather than surrendering. It showed the effectiveness of informant-based intelligence when properly incentivized and protected. And it marked a turning point in the narrative of the war, a moment when the old regime's power structure was definitively shattered. For the Iraqi people, the deaths of Uday and Qusay meant different things to different communities. For those who had suffered under their cruelty, it was liberation. For those who had prospered under the Ba'athist system, it was the loss of a familiar, if brutal, order. For the American military, it was validation that the mission to dismantle Saddam's regime was progressing, even as the broader challenges of occupation and reconstruction were just beginning. The legacy. Today, the villa in Mosul's Al-Fala neighborhood is long gone, rebuilt or replaced in the years since 2003. The names Uday and Qusay Hussein remain synonymous with the brutality of Saddam's Iraq, a dark chapter in the country's history. The $30 million paid to Nawaf al-Zaidan stands as a reminder of the power of financial incentives in intelligence operations and the moral complexity of such transactions. And the 6-hour battle itself remains a case study in urban warfare, special operations tactics, and the challenges of high-value target operations in hostile environments. The hunt for Saddam's sons ended in fire and rubble on a summer day in Mosul. The consequences of that day, and of the broader war in Iraq, continue to echo through the region and the world. If this story gave you insight into one of the Iraq War's most significant moments, hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into modern military history. Drop a comment with your thoughts on this operation. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.